Today we're going to talk about a crime that was said to be the most terrible crime ever committed in Indiana. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. Hi everyone, so before we jump in, I just want to remind you that viewer discretion is advised. Oftentimes we show things like crime scene photos or we talk about details of a case that might be disturbing or triggering to some people. So please proceed with caution from this point forward. On October 26, 1965, police would find 16-year-old Sylvia Lincoln's emancipated corpse. The body was covered with more than 150 wounds. Some of these wounds were burns, some were cuts, and they found her on this filthy, blood-covered mattress at the home of 37-year-old Gertrude Banaszewski. And Gertrude was actually the mother of 7 other children. So Sylvia came from a large and poor family, and they came from southern Boone County, which was just northwest of Indianapolis. Her father, Lester Likens, only had an 8th grade education, and he really did work a lot of odd jobs just trying to make a living to support his family. He had a laundry route, he worked in factories, he even once owned a small restaurant, which had turned out to be unsuccessful. And he had started working with carnies and traveling and selling food from a concession cart. And that was actually the work that him and his wife decided to return to during that summer of 1965, which meant that they needed somebody to watch their children. Diana, their oldest child, was grown and married. They had 2 sons, Danny and Benny, and they placed them with their grandparents, which just left the 2 girls, Sylvia and Jenny. Jenny was said to be a very shy and insecure girl, and this is because she had a limp because of a case of childhood polio, and Sylvia was outwardly more confident than her sister. And she even went by the nickname Cookie, and she was very pretty, but she always kept her mouth closed when she was smiling because she was missing a front tooth. And a mutual friends of the Likens and Gertrude actually introduced the families. And Gertrude lived in this big rented house on a corner street, and the family decided that it would be good to board Sylvia and Jenny there while they worked. So they were going to do that for $20 a week. But Gertrude was already caring for 7 of her own children. She had Paula, who was 17, John, who was 12, Stephanie, who was 15, Maria, who was 11, Shirley, who was 10, and James and Dennis, who were 18 months. And from the beginning, there was kind of a clash between Sylvia and Gertrude's daughter, 17-year-old Paula. And that's kind of the seed that began to grow during this time in the house. And things were going okay for some time. That was until one week when a $20 check arrived late, and Gertrude was frustrated, so she beat the girls, although they couldn't help that the check had arrived late. And after this beating, Gertrude seemed to enjoy it. She actually began to escalate the beatings and the torture on Sylvia mostly over the next few weeks. And the attacks became violent and even more sadistic as time went on. And not only was Gertrude the one beating and torturing Sylvia, she actually had her own children, and some of the neighborhood children also beat Sylvia and torture her. Some of these kids were as young as 10 years old, and none of them ever reported what was happening in that house of horrors. And this was an adult telling children it was okay to beat and harm and torture a poor 16-year-old girl who didn't do anything to deserve it in any sort of way. And what's even worse about this crime is all of the perpetrators of this crime would eventually walk free from the prison system. And this case is truly disturbing for so many reasons, not just because of the beatings and the torture, and not only because neighborhood kids and Gertrude's own children took a part in these beatings, but because other adults actually noticed Sylvia's state, and none of them ever reported it to police. No one even asked if she was okay or if she was safe. They just shut their mouths and went about their lives. It came out in trial that not only did Sylvia have opportunities to tell someone what was happening, but her sister Jenny did as well. They could tell somebody at school or church, and they even had relatives living nearby. And Jenny would go on to say that they didn't tell anybody because they figured it would make the situation worse. They didn't believe that police would actually come in and arrest these people and remove them from the house. And it's actually really disturbing because, as I said, not only was Gertrude torturing and beating this young 16-year-old girl, but neighborhood kids were coming in and out of the house as well. They would just come in, watch the beatings, watch the torture. Sometimes they would participate, and none of them felt disturbed enough to tell an adult what was happening. It was truly just disgusting and mind-boggling at the same time. And then on October 26, 1965, Gertrude had to call the police because Sylvia Likens was dead. So the police come to the house, they go upstairs, and they see Sylvia laying on this dirty, disgusting mattress. She has wounds all over her body. There's something actually carved into her stomach. "I am a prostitute" was actually etched into her stomach. And of course, police are looking at this crime scene thinking, what is this? What happened? And Gertrude would go on to say that she was attacked by a gang of boys. They came in the house and they attacked her. And there was something written on her hand that apparently confirmed the story, supposedly. But cops realized as they began looking at Sylvia's body that this wasn't a one-time thing. This didn't just happen. There was tons of cuts and bruises and lacerations. There was even one spot where they tried to brand her and it looks like a 3, but I guess it was actually supposed to be an S. And so Gertrude was arrested. As you can see, Gertrude was frail and underweight, but she had 2 primary weapons that she used against Sylvia. One was a fraternity-style paddle, and the other was a thick leather belt that her ex-husband left behind. And it's interesting to note that her ex-husband, John, was actually a police officer. And Gertrude began using this paddle on Sylvia and Jenny for various offenses. Things like if they exchanged bottles from soft drinks at the nearby store to get money back, they would get paddled for. When she suspected Sylvia of stealing, she burned the girl's fingertips with matches. And when Gertrude felt too weak due to her asthma, she would have her 17-year-old daughter, Paula, discipline the girls for her. And then when the neighborhood kids were kind of invited into this situation, they enacted terrible crimes against Sylvia. Sometimes they would throw her into a wall or they would kick her repeatedly. Some of them extinguished their cigarettes on her skin. I just want to note that this is a trigger warning because what happens next is very violent, graphic, and disturbing, so please be advised. On one occasion, Gertrude and a gang of teenagers actually had Sylvia undress in front of them and forced her to insert an empty Coke bottle into her vagina as they watched. And this wasn't just the kids. Gertrude was standing right there as it happened and encouraging it to happen. She's a deeply sick and disturbed woman. And usually after a beating, Sylvia was forced to take a really hot, scalding hot bath to cleanse her of her sins. So obviously she has open wounds, she's bruised, she's bleeding all the time, and then they put her in the scalding hot bath, which just burned her skin, which made everything worse. And then one evening when Sylvia actually wet her mattress because of all the stress she was under and her body is taking all of these beatings, Gertrude actually beat Sylvia and burnt her, and then decided that she couldn't live with the other children. She was actually thrown down the cellar stairs and locked in the basement, and she was no longer allowed to leave that home. They only gave her crackers to eat, and she wasn't even allowed to use the bathroom. So they were effectively starving her, and she had to just go to the bathroom down there in the basement. There was no other place for her to go. And then one day, Gertrude announced to all the children that Sylvia was a prostitute and that Sylvia was proud of it. So we'll just put that on her stomach. So she took out a large needle and began to carve those words into Sylvia's stomach. And she managed to put, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," on the girl's stomach. And one of the neighborhood boys actually finished the etching for Gertrude. And that neighborhood boy was Richard Hobbs. And when Gertrude realized that Sylvia was dying from these brutal injuries, she forced Sylvia to write a note saying that a gang of neighborhood boys did this to her. And the plan was to blindfold Sylvia and dump her in the nearby woods with the note. And when Sylvia did try to escape, Gertrude and one of the boys caught her and beat her terribly and threw her back in the cellar. Sylvia Likens died on October 26, 1965, and her cause of death was determined to be brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging of the brain, and shock induced by Sylvia's extensive skin damage. She also suffered extreme malnutrition. This poor child went through so much pain and torture, and it is so incredibly disturbing that not only did one person partake in this, but a gang of people did, and nobody, even adults coming in and not participating, who's seen Sylvia suffering, didn't say a word. I am sickened and just flabbergasted by it. So this case goes to trial, and there are quite a few defendants. Gertrude was actually found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. And then she was granted a retrial, but she was also found guilty during that retrial. And during her time in the women's prison, she was a model prisoner, and prisoners even called her mom. And in spite of public outcry, Gertrude was paroled in 1985. She moved to Iowa right after her release and changed her name to Nadine. She did end up dying of lung cancer in June of 1990, and she never took responsibility for her crimes against Sylvia. In fact, she just said she couldn't remember them. And as I stated earlier, when Gertrude, who was asthmatic and kind of frail in general, couldn't do the beatings on Sylvia, she asked her 17-year-old daughter Paula to do so, and Paula did so enthusiastically. She did not like Sylvia and she wanted to hurt her. In 1966, Paula was convicted of second-degree murder, but in 1971, her conviction was overturned due to a technicality, and instead of refacing another trial, she actually pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, and she only received 2 to 21 years in prison for this. And in spite of attempting to break out of prison, she was actually paroled in March of 1972 and then released completely from parole in March of 1974. She actually changed her name to Paula Pace and wasn't heard from again until 2012. She was actually discovered living in a small town in Iowa, and she was working at a school system, and she had 2 grown sons. And when it was discovered who she was fired from her position at the school. And she was fired because she provided false information on her application. And since then, she's kind of slipped off the grid. No one seems to know where she is. And the second oldest of Gertrude's children was Stephanie, who was 15 at the time. And although she did admit to participating in some of the crimes, she was actually granted a special trial. And all crimes against her were dropped. And it seems the charges against her were dropped because she agreed to be a witness for the state. She apparently changed her name, she got married, she had children, and now lives in Florida. John was the third oldest of Gertrude's children and was an active participant in the torture of Sylvia. And he became the youngest inmate at Indiana State Reformatory, and he only served 2 years before being released. After that, he changed his name to John Blake and kind of drifted aimlessly until apparently he had a religious experience that helped him see, quote, the error of his ways. And although he was the only one of the family members that publicly had remorse for his actions, he didn't hide who he was. He even spoke about it publicly on occasion. He's reportedly a minister and a real estate agent with his wife and has 3 children. He would die of cancer at the age of 52 in 2005. And he once told a reporter, quote, "My mom was a very selfish, self-centered woman," which was the understatement of the year. Gertrude's 4th oldest child, Marie, who was 11 at the time, had no charges brought against her. And during the trial, she was the only member of the entire family who went on stand and actually cried. None of the other members of the family showed any sign of remorse. They didn't cry on stand, but she did as she recounted the terror that happened in that house. And apparently she still lives in Indiana. Shirley was the youngest of Gertrude's children at only 10 who participated in the torture of Sylvia. She actually heated a needle and burned Sylvia with it repeatedly, but she never faced any charges. And her whereabouts are unknown today. Gertrude's son, who was only 8 at the time, was not arrested nor called to testify at the trial. But some reports do suggest he played a role in the crime. And out of all the children in that family, the least is known about him. They don't know where he is, they don't know if he has a family, they don't know what happened to him. And Dennis, who was the youngest of Gertrude's children, was only a newborn when this was happening. And apparently he was placed in foster care and was later adopted. He died in 2012 in California. So Stephanie, Gertrude's daughter, was only 15 at the time, but she did have a boyfriend who was known as Coy Hubbard, and he was a full participant in Sylvia's torture. He used her as a practicing dummy for judo flips and punches and shoved her down the basement stairs. He was convicted of manslaughter and served only 2 years before being released. In the 1970s, Coy was actually working at a gas station, and his attorney actually ran into him there, and Coy told his attorney, "Oh, come inside, I want you to meet my boss and stuff." He seemed like he was doing okay. He actually never changed his name and remained in that area for most of his adult life. And then in 1982, he was actually tried for another murder but was acquitted. He reportedly lost his job in June of 2007 when a film about this crime debuted. He actually died in June of that year. Richard Hobbs was another neighborhood kid that actually played a role in Sylvia's death. He actually finished the carving into Sylvia's stomach. He was convicted of manslaughter and served only 2 years, but would later die in 1972 of cancer at the age of 21. So Sylvia's father, Lester, he actually visited the house on October 5th, which was just a few weeks before Sylvia's death. He didn't see anything out of the norm, but he was only ever allowed in the living room, and he once was in the kitchen. He reportedly died in February of 2013 at the age of 86 in California. And Betty, Sylvia's mother, was obviously devastated by what happened. When she was on stand, she really could only give short answers. She was overcome with grief, and I'm sure she felt guilty for what happened to her daughter. She actually divorced Lester in 1967 and remarried. She would die in May of 1998 at the age of 71. And then in the trial, it also came out that Diana, who was the sister of Sylvia and Jenny, actually received a call from Jenny, and they asked her for help and they pleaded with her for help. And Diana kind of ignored their plea for help. She thought they were just kind of grumbling because because they were uncomfortable and they didn't want to be there. But one day she arrived at the house for a visit with the girls, and Gertrude wouldn't let her in there. And that raised her suspicions. And she spotted Jenny, and when Jenny saw her sister, she said she wasn't allowed to talk to Diana and ran away. And so Diana actually called a social worker, and when the social worker showed up to Gertrude's house, Jenny was forced to tell that social worker that Sylvia had run away, and no further action was taken. They didn't look for Sylvia, they didn't go inside the house, they didn't do anything to find out what happened to this girl. Diana would actually make headlines recently when her and her husband, who were both diabetics, got lost and stranded in their car for 2 weeks in the California backcountry. And all they had was rainwater to drink, a pie, and some oranges. Her husband actually did not survive the ordeal. He died of a heart attack. And Diana was near death when she was found and rescued. And Jenny, Sylvia's sister, who was in the house while she was being abused and sometimes took abuse, didn't actually suffer as much as Sylvia. And a lot of people question why Jenny didn't do anything. She had the ability to tell neighbors. She had the ability to go to school and tell her teachers or other students. She could tell another adult. And maybe because she tried to tell Diana and Diana wasn't successful, she didn't feel comfortable doing it again. And people, of course, wonder why Sylvia didn't get help before it escalated and she was trapped inside. And a lot of the times people conclude that she really never had a situation where she asked for help and people actually came to help her. So she didn't bother. And that's heartbreaking in so many ways. And when Sylvia finally died and the police were called, Jenny told one of the police officers, "You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." And in 2004, at the age of 54, Jenny died. And this crime is obviously infamous for so many reasons. This poor 16-year-old child was beaten and brutalized by her supposed caregiver and a group of neighborhood kids and the caregiver's children. This is a vicious crime, and her body was mutilated, and everything about this crime is so dark and disturbing. And it really makes you wonder how somebody like Gertrude could exist and why Gertrude would ever include children in this beating. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.